Okay, wait. When did my board get fixed?
Last week. They had it up last week.
Yeah.
Y'all didn't realize there was a rolling cart in here the entire year?
It was like that last year too.
What?
Yes, it was like that. As of like March or something.
Last year it was the same.
Yeah. This board was broken for like 6 months before they fixed it. Okay. Okay. Whatever. I guess you'll let me know. I guess you let me know if the lecture video did not show the PowerPoint last time. Okay. If it did, great. If it didn't, we'll figure something out. I don't know. All right. So we're going to talk about civil rights. All right. And again, just as a real quick review, because I told you the other day, you cannot use civil rights and civil liberties interchangeably. They do not mean the same thing. All right. So again, as a reminder, civil liberties are protections for you individually from governmental overreach. Right? That means that they protect you from governmental behaviors that are detrimental to your sort of general freedom. All right? Civil rights, on the other hand, really pertains to who is capable of participating, right? And what are sort of the processes that are involved in that participation. All right? That becomes the general idea. So what that means is civil rights are group protections in order to allow groups to participate in government and governmental behaviors, and ensuring that people and groups, subsets of the population, are treated the same under the law, right? So that goes back to that concept at the very beginning of the school year called rule of law, and the idea that we're all treated the same. All right, that is an essential aspect or an essential concept within civil rights. And once civil rights have been applied to some subset of the population, they are really, once civil rights have been challenged by somebody or some subset of the population, they are now applicable to all subsets. Okay, it should be up there now. If you'll refresh, and it should be directly above the quiz. All right. So hopefully it shouldn't strike you as odd that the United States has a history of problems as it pertains to civil rights, yes? Yeah. I'm sure that you're well versed at this point in having learned that the United States, upon its foundation, upon it becoming a nation, slavery still existed within the country. That is a clear violation of civil rights, right? Like you cannot sit here and preach all people are created equally and everybody is endowed with specific rights based upon their yada yada yada, and then enslave some subset of the population, right? That is discriminatory behavior. So that's really what we're looking at with civil rights, is concepts of discrimination, right? So we'll be talking about varying subsets of the population now, and how those different subsets get discriminated against. Okay, so do we understand that? All right. And then I need you to realize that as we go through this, there's varying levels of degree in terms of who we can and can't discriminate against. All right, and hopefully that will become clear. Okay. So again, the concepts here that pertain to all of this as we look at it, right? Again, comparing civil liberties and civil rights. Liberties apply to the individual, right? Liberties are protection against governmental overreach, right? Liberties are protected through due process, right? Meaning that you cannot have your liberty taken from you unless certain steps have been met. Yes? Okay? Like you have freedom of speech. Can you be denied freedom of speech? Yes. You can, provided your speech infringes in some way upon others' rights. Right? Can you be denied freedom of religion? Yes. I cannot practice whatever the Aztec religion was and sacrifice you. That's not permissible. Right? There are limitations. No, there's limitations. Right? But how do we know where those limitations exist as far as civil liberties go? Once my freedom is infringing upon your freedom, that's generally where we're going to draw a line. Okay? Civil rights, on the other hand, are group protections. They are protections against discrimination, right? And they are protected through the Equal Protection Clause. Okay? The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment basically says we will treat all subsets of the population similarly, right? Meaning if we provide some group with some sort of advantage, right, that group, or that advantage, excuse me, must be applied equally to other groups. Alright? That's the basic idea. Alright? And so we'll sort of bounce back and forth and we'll look at different groups and different issues as we go through this. So we'll start here sort of looking at women and looking at actual participation. Right? Because as we talk about political participation as a civil right, okay, I want you to understand that like voting and participation is a right, not a liberty. You understand? Okay, because once we gave a woman the right to vote, all women get the right to vote. Once we gave a black man the right to vote, all black men get the right to vote. Okay? And the reality is once we have provided voting or suffrage, that's the word that you need to associate with voting. Once we have provided suffrage to some subset of the population, suffrage should be applied universally to all aspects of the population. Yes? We understand that. Okay. So, then it gets into different subgroups, right? Because how many of you right now are not allowed to vote? So you're being discriminated against, yes? But by definition, yes. Right? By definition, you are being discriminated against. Okay? And hopefully you will realize that sort of age-based discrimination is going to be the easiest or the most justifiable discrimination that exists. Yes? Right? Raise your hand if you can legally consume alcohol. Right? Why am I the only one that can legally consume alcohol? Why is 21 the age? I don't know. That's a good answer, Rodney. Right? It's actually biological. And here's the thing. In order to discriminate, you actually have to have grounds for discrimination. Right? There's like medical evidence that because of your age, because of your like physiological development, your body is not completely developed. Specifically, your liver is not completely developed. Your liver is responsible for filtering toxins out of your body. And make no mistake, alcohol is a toxin. Right? Therefore, if your toxin filtering system is inferior because it's not fully developed, you don't want to put additional strain on it trying to filter out toxins. Yes? Yeah. Logically sound argument, isn't it? Okay? That's why we don't let 12-year-olds consume alcohol. It's that simple.
How come like 18 is only
So physiologically, your body's actually not fully developed until like 25. I mean, on some level, the drinking age should be 25, but then obviously, hopefully you realize that everybody's body is different. Some of your bodies might be fully developed by, your liver might be fully developed by 22, right? Like, the concept of having a medical test in order to determine when people can and cannot consume alcohol would be sort of ridiculous, although I guess we do that for marijuana, so maybe it's not that ridiculous. But the 18 to 21 is actually a semi-new development that we'll get to, Maddie. Yes, ma'am?
Why do other countries, why do they have younger ages to consume alcohol? Do they
Yeah,
don't
like
like
in
livers?
In the Dominican
No,
Republic.
so part of that, I mean, a large part of that is cultural, and it's a determinant upon what you're drinking, when you're drinking, and how much you're drinking, right? I mean, the reality is it depends on like the medical studies you read anymore in this day and age. there are some medical studies that tell you that like a glass of red wine a day is actually medically beneficial to your health, right? Drinking 4 bottles of red wine a day is not beneficial to your health, right? So part of it just stems from like the cultural aspects of it. I mean, I think there would actually be a logical argument and a significant argument to have in the United States as to whether or not we shouldn't lower the drinking age and actually raise the driving age, right? Because on some level, you should probably learn how to drink before you learn how to drive, right? Because if you turn 21 and then you go out and you've never had, I mean, assume you're a law-abiding citizen and you've never had alcohol before, right? And so you have 2 or 3 drinks, you have no idea how 2 or 3 drinks affects you, and then you get behind the wheel of a car, and even at that point, even if, let's just say for the sake of argument, you were not legally intoxicated, right, that you were at a 0.05 or whatever, in terms of a blood alcohol level, I mean, at that point, you were not legally drunk, but you are impaired, and if you don't know how to respond to that, that's problematic. I mean, again, not related to today, but there's again, medical studies, there's studies that have been done that can actually show sleep deprivation provides the same driving, what's the word I'm looking for? Detriment as drinking does, right? So like if you were driving excessively tired or you were driving drunk, your driving behaviors would be equally poor, right? But obviously well, I mean, there are actually now laws for truck drivers that truck drivers can't drive more than like 10 hours in a day for that reason, right? So, you know, but then that also gets to the whole like 21 versus 18 concept, because we lowered the voting age to 18 as a result of Vietnam. And then, I mean, again, from a logical standpoint, there's a part of me that would argue if you're responsible enough to determine who the next president of the United States is at 18, why are you not responsible enough to determine whether or not you should have a glass of wine or a beer or even, you know, a mixed drink or whatever, like, or 4 or 5 on a Friday night if you're staying in the house and you're not going to call it a Friday night. Right? And, so when you look at women, biggest issue in civil rights for women was obviously the right to vote. Well, let's actually go with the biggest is the right to vote. But if you go back and you look historically, you know, like in the 18th century and even into the 19th century, you know, like women were not allowed to own property. They weren't allowed to own businesses, right? There were all sorts of detrimental aspects in terms of like civil rights. Right? Clearly nothing in terms of civil rights has been worse than slavery. That shouldn't surprise anybody, and hopefully I don't really need to go into this. The only things that I will sort of tell you as it pertains to the one, there are people from essentially the moment that slaves arrive into North America or into what becomes America, there are some people that are already beginning to advocate against it, right, that see it as being detrimental. Some of those people believe that it's morally detrimental or it's morally wrong. There are actually other arguments in the 17th and 18th centuries that slavery is economically wrong, which interestingly enough it actually is. Right? And that might not be logical for you to think about, because on some level if you have free labor that should be better for you economically. But slavery actually like inhibits innovation, which is bad economically, right? Part of the reason why I don't know, if y'all learned this in U.S. history class, that like the North became commercial and industrial and grew economically way before the South did, right? Because the South had slavery. There was no incentive for the South to change, right? They just wanted to continue doing the same thing. All right. As far as like African American civil rights go, just so you really actually understand, and again, I don't know how well your U.S. history teachers would have taught this. I'm sure you learned about the Dred Scott case, right? So Scott was a slave taken to a free territory. master dies, sues for his freedom because he's in a free territory. The actual Supreme Court decision, because I think most of us know that, like, oh, he didn't get his freedom. No. The actual Supreme Court decision is just way so much worse than that, right? It's bad that we tell Scott, like, no, sorry, dude, you're a slave. What's worse is the Supreme Court actually says, one, not only are you a slave, you're not a citizen. Because you are not a citizen and because you are property, you do not have standing with which to sue, right? So essentially, the Supreme Court equates Dred Scott to your toaster, right? Like, you understand your toaster cannot sue you, right? Even if your toaster is dirty and you don't ever clean the breadcrumbs out of the bottom of it, your toaster has no legal recourse against you. And the Supreme Court says the same thing about Dred Scott. Okay? That regardless of whether or not slavery is immoral or whatever, just or whatever, Scott himself is essentially denied humanity. Therefore, he is not allowed to sue. Right? Now, that is fixed with the 14th Amendment. Again, 14th Amendment is arguably one of the most important amendments that's ever passed or ratified in the United States. The 14th Amendment has, in addition to like the Free Exercise Clause and the Due Process Clause, it also has what's called the Citizenship Clause, which says anybody born in the United States or naturalized to the United States is a citizen of the United States and of the state in which they reside, and therefore they get all the protections of citizenship. That means Dred Scott is a citizen. Okay? Now, obviously, the 14th Amendment doesn't come until after slavery has been eradicated in the United States. Okay? But that's the idea. All right, women's rights movements, again, sort of bouncing back and forth here. They're starting with the desire to be able to participate politically, right? That means voting rights. Okay? And early on, just so you understand, there's a fair amount of correlation between like abolition and women's rights. There were a lot of women, white women, who were adamant, just ardent abolitionists, wanted to see slaves freed, wanted to see slaves get legal protection, legal standing, political protections within the United States. They wholeheartedly believed that if they helped secure freedom and voting rights for black men, that they would be included in that, right? Unfortunately for them, they weren't, right? Black men get the right to vote in 1868. I don't remember the exact year. I don't test you on years. They get the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. No, that might have been 71. Anyways, white women don't get the right to vote until way later, right? So as far as civil rights go, you do need to understand the Civil War amendments, because they play into civil rights, right? So the 13th abolishes slavery, 14th provides a whole bunch of things, and then the 15th provides suffrage. Okay? So those are wildly important. I do want to at least call your attention to the 13th Amendment and the real problem with the 13th Amendment, right? Because theoretically that's awesome that the 13th Amendment bans slavery, right? Are we all in agreement there? We want to end slavery?
Yes.
Does the 13th Amendment end slavery? It unfortunately does not. I mean, it does, but it doesn't. There's a small provision in the 13th Amendment that says except when, like, punishment for a crime. Okay? It's actually something that gets slipped in there that, again, hopefully a U.S. history teacher would have taught you about. But it's essentially a means or a method of future lawmakers' ability to institute like Jim Crow laws, right? So the 13th actually reads, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States, right? Again, that means that if you have been convicted of a crime, you can be enslaved again, okay? That's one of those things that happens in Jim Crow that, again, I hope you would have already been aware of in terms of a U.S. history class, right? Southern states specifically passed laws like black men had to have a job, right? And then if they saw a black man walking down the street on a Tuesday, they would be like, oh, you don't have a job, and then they would throw you in jail for not having a job, and then they would enslave you. Alright? I don't care about Reconstruction, that's history. Continued denial of women's suffrage, so again, I just mentioned this, right? Women don't get the right to vote. Women won't get the right to vote until 1890-ish, right, in Wyoming. I think it's Wyoming, might be Montana, I can never remember. But one of these states up here where nobody lives, right, they give women the right to vote in the 19th century. Sorry, yeah, 19th century, okay, before the United States does. Okay, and I bring that up to illustrate a couple of points. One, you should recognize voting is a state right issue, yes? States control voting. I need you to realize that. Okay, that means states can determine for themselves who can and cannot vote. Okay, that's also just a really interesting concept for you to understand, because then that gets into the concept of statehood and what it takes to become a state. Right? Because one of the requirements constitutionally in order to become a state is you have to have a certain number of voters. You let women vote, now they count, so you can become a state quicker. Alright? By the end of the 19th century, although we have the 14th Amendment is not interpreted by the Supreme Court in the same manner in which we currently interpret the 14th Amendment. Right? So that means that the current 14th Amendment's interpretation is vastly different. Alright? So in 1896, we have a Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy was an African American who essentially gets himself intentionally arrested in order to challenge a doctrine as to whether or not people can be separated on train cars based upon race. Okay? And the Supreme Court decides in 1896 that separate but equal is a permissible ideology. That it's fine, it's okay. Right? Do we believe that today?
No.
Are you sure, Rodney? Do we have separate but equal facilities?
I mean,
What's that, Rodney?
like that, right?
Yeah. We do still believe in separate but equal as it pertains to gender, don't we? Okay? Alright, so there is some aspect. Now, that really gets into, like, conceptually what constitutes separate but equal. Do we realize that? Because here's the thing. We all understand that bathrooms today are separate but equal, yes?
Yes.
Do we actually believe that they're equal?
What?
I mean,
Are they actually equal?
Or what? Sorry.
The restrooms here.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're all good, right? They're actually equal. Right? Like, that's fine. Okay? So why was separate but equal not okay as it pertained to race? Because it's not actually equal. Do y'all understand that? Like, I show my U.S. history kids, like, I show them images of a Kansas schoolhouse, right, that was like the black school in 1950, right? And then I showed them a picture of, like, a white school in Kansas in 1950. And what's the difference? It's not just a matter of, like, run down, right? But, like, black schoolhouses in the middle of the 20th century would be like one room, right? That might have, like, pews, right? Like long benches. Everybody together in one room. That means you might have a 13-year-old and a 5-year-old in the same room learning. Now, obviously, we should realize that a 5-year-old and a 13-year-old should not be learning the same thing, yes? Okay, hopefully that 13-year-old will be significantly more advanced. Okay, but you were looking at schoolhouses that didn't have books, didn't have a chalkboard, right? Didn't have all sorts of things. In some extreme instances, like, didn't have heat or air conditioning. Well, air conditioning wasn't really a thing back then, right? But, like, didn't have heat. Right? Maybe it had a fireplace where you could like light a fire. But if y'all don't know like how bad insulation was and things like that, like a fireplace in a room, let's say 4 times this size, right, a 2,000 square foot room, right? One fireplace is not going to heat a 2,000 square foot room, right? Which means if you're far away from the fire, you're not really going to be warm. Okay? So it's not. It is not separate but equal. Okay? And so eventually we're going to overturn that. We overturned that with Brown versus Board of Education. That's really where that comes out of, right? So again, if we were talking about your SCOTUS case, right? You've got to pick a case that you're going to write about. You would not be able to write about Plessy versus Ferguson because it's overturned with Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education is done through the NAACP. Okay, so that is a interest group. We've talked about interest groups that's going to utilize the court system or litigation in order to try to put pressure on policies that they dislike. Okay, so they're going to try to create their change in that method, right? Women are going to organize and do the same thing, right? They're going to try to put political pressure on organizations and utilize the legal route in order to try to obtain what they want as far as civil rights go as well. Eventually, women will get the 19th Amendment passed, all right? World War II is a relatively significant turning point as far as civil rights go in America. And that should be relatively obvious for us. Hopefully we have a general understanding of what World War II was like. We know that Hitler was massacring Jews, yes? Okay, so that's genocide, that's ethnic cleansing, whatever you want to call it. That is an atrocity. That is a race-based atrocity. Okay? And yet here in the United States, while we're the quote-unquote good guys, right, and we were fighting against somebody that was engaged in genocide, right, we come back to the United States to a segregated society. Okay? Specifically in the South. The South is still very segregated. The North, not quite so much, right? But the South is very segregated. And so, and specifically then for like African American veterans, right? Specifically Southern blacks who had served in the military, they go to Europe and they see what they're fighting for, what they were fighting against. They return home, and in a lot of cases, they didn't seem that much different to them, right? It didn't seem like the United States was necessarily that great. And so, early on, after the war, when we return, we're going to start seeing some significant changes in terms of civil rights. Now, obviously, you learned in U.S. history class that it's really the 1960s that is that predominant civil rights era, yes? There are some early gains, though, well in advance of that. One of them is Truman, who desegregates the military, right? Through World War II, the United States military was segregated. We had black units and white units, right? After World War II, because it's his military and he's the commander-in-chief, he can do what he wants with it, Truman's going to change that, and that's going to help begin to shift public perceptions about those things, right? The Supreme Court is going to get a little bit more, I'm going to call it liberal in their ideology, right? But they're going to begin to care a little bit more about equality. They're going to begin to care a little bit more about equal protection under the law. So there's going to be a number of different cases that get passed, right, that are going to start rejecting policies frequently in the South of states that are, of institutions, right, that are engaged in discriminatory behaviors, right? They're going to start, it's through the court system that we're going to desegregate schools. It's through the court system that we're going to desegregate businesses to some extent. Shelley v. Kramer, for instance, gets rid of restrictive covenants, so you can't require, or you can't basically require demographic conformity within contractual things, right? And then that brings us to Brown v. Board, which is obviously, well, probably should be considered one of the most important cases of all time. It's really what's going to be a springboard for the civil rights movement that will occur, right? So this is Topeka, Kansas. That's the actual Board of Education that we're talking about, right? And so Linda Brown is going to attend what was an all-white school there. Thurgood Marshall is the NAACP lead attorney. Thurgood Marshall will go on to be the first black man appointed to the Supreme Court, right? So he's actually in a very unique, he's in unique company, having just been on the Supreme Court. The number of Supreme Court judges, justices, that's actually the appropriate term, justices. The number of Supreme Court justices in American history is a relatively small number. But Marshall is even a little bit more unique in the sense that he is on the short list of people to both argue a case in front of the Supreme Court and then subsequently sit on the bench and decide Supreme Court cases, right? So Brown versus Board is going to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, and you are not going to be able to use race as a criteria for discrimination, right? So if race is being taken into account for discriminatory behaviors, that's not going to be permissible anymore, all right? Now, we'll get to that because it's going to come up again, all right? What the court puts in place after Brown versus Board of Education is this concept of scrutiny, right? So scrutiny is looking at the government's responsibility in order to justify discriminatory behaviors, right? So again, we're going to use race-based discrimination as the easy sort of low-hanging fruit. Can my 8-year-old drive a car? No. Is that discriminatory? Technically, yes. Right? Does the government have logical grounds for creating that discriminatory policy?
Heck yeah.
Yes. And here's what I want you to understand, right? Because obviously you realize that with my 8-year-old, no. Right? But what about a 15-year-old? So think back to like the last day you spent as a 15-year-old, right? And then you went to sleep. And then you woke up and magically you were 16. Did you just get a whole lot smarter overnight while you slept? Did you just mature so much that you are now responsible enough to drive like a 2-ton death machine? Actually, cars are what, like 1 ton? Probably not even a ton anymore.
Who knows?
Yeah, they probably weigh half a ton these days.
Yeah,
Cars are getting, they're made of fiberglass now, right? They're cheaper and cheaper. But you understand my point, right? Like, you did not somehow mature magically overnight that you are now significantly more capable of operating a motor vehicle, right? Okay? But we have to draw a line somewhere, all right? So that scrutiny test is the idea of where do we draw lines, and yes, they will be arbitrary. I'm sure we all have friends that are 16, right, that you're like, yeah, that 16-year-old don't need a license. They're not mature enough to drive a car. Whereas I'm sure you probably have met a 15-year-old that you were like, yeah, I would probably trust them. They're mature and responsible, right? Or at least as mature and responsible as your average 16 or 17-year-old that does have a license, all right? And so what this does is this ends de jure segregation. That's a vocab term you need to understand. De jure is by law. De facto is by fact, or really by choice. And de facto segregation still exists today. All right, and de facto segregation is a whole lot harder to get rid of. Okay, and we'll talk about that moving forward as well. All right, so I think I've got 5 minutes, right? Because some of y'all are already packing up. You're making me nervous. Okay, so hopefully I can get through sort of desegregation of schools. All right. But here's what you should understand, right? We passed Brown versus Board of Education, and theoretically that means overnight, right? Once that decision is rendered, all schools should be desegregated. Okay? This is the way that civil rights works. I need you to understand that. right? Once the Supreme Court has rendered its verdict, right, segregation as it pertains to public schools is no longer permissible. Period. Hard stop. Now, hopefully you recognize that southern states, and specifically sort of country backwoods places in the South, are not going to be accepting of a Supreme Court decision that overnight tells them that they need to desegregate. Yes? Okay, so it's going to take a little bit of time. There is some significant resistance to it. There's actually a Brown versus Board of Education 2, in which the Supreme Court essentially issues a secondary ruling to the case. It's like, hey, you need to do this post haste, right? Meaning as quickly as possible, right? We'll get to the point where the United States federal government is actually going to have to step in. Eisenhower in '57, for instance, is going to mobilize the National Guard. You have George Wallace, who was the governor of Alabama, running around talking about segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He personally was trying to block the entrance to the University of Alabama to prevent black students from entering that campus, right? Again, you're going to end up in situations where the National Guard or the military is going to have to come and make sure that they are actually enforcing the Supreme Court laws or the Supreme Court decision, right? You're going to have other issues, the Montgomery bus boycott. Again, you desegregate schools. That does not, and I need you to understand this too, that does not apply to all segregation, period. Yes? Once you have desegregated schools, that does not mean that all segregation is going to end instantaneously. It simply means that we recognize the inequality that had existed in an academic setting. Okay? That does not mean all inequality everywhere. Right? So that's going to lead to other sorts of phases of desegregation, such as Rosa Parks and bus boycotts, right? Voting rights, things like that. We're going to see a whole bunch of other peaceful protests and opportunities to try to prevent segregation from taking place, right? So again, picture on the left is bus boycotts. Picture on the right is the Woolworths, or is indicative. I actually don't know if that one's Woolworths or not, but indicative of the Woolworths lunch counter sit-ins in which black people are trying to desegregate businesses, diners. Woolworths was actually like a department store. It was like a Sears-ish type place, but it had a lunch counter there that did not allow, didn't serve African Americans. Actually, one of my more favorite things to teach at my old school in North Carolina, because they actually played a direct role in that specific sit-in, right? Because that sit-in is from Greensboro, North Carolina, where I used to teach. Right? The Civil Rights Act of '64 is going to strengthen a whole bunch of earlier things, right? Public accommodations desegregated. We're going to desegregate a whole bunch more. We're going to allow the Justice Department to implement desegregation orders to overtake specifically southern state institutions. So if the states have a history of problematic behavior, the national government is going to be able to come in and take over control. All right, have a good day. We'll stop there.